Tonight we're going to travel a long way from where you are now. We're going back in time almost 200 years to a city in the north of Scotland, Edinburgh in the 1820s. It was a city of grand stone buildings and narrow winding streets, of university halls and churchyards, of fog rolling in from the sea and smoke rising from 1,000 chimneys. It was also, at that time, one of the most important cities in Europe for the study of medicine. Students came from all over Britain and beyond to learn there, drawn by the reputation of its teachers and the quality of its schools. But beneath all of that ambition and progress, there was a problem. A quiet, uncomfortable problem that most people preferred not to think about too carefully. And it was that problem, left unsolved for too long, that led to one of the most infamous criminal cases in Scottish history. This is the story of how it happened, who was involved, and what came after. But all of that is ahead of us. For now, just settle in and let yourself relax. In the early years of the 19th century, Edinburgh had a reputation that reached far beyond Scotland. It was one of the best places in all of Europe to study anatomy. The city had several brilliant teachers working in the field. Alexander Monro was one of them, and after him, his son, also named Alexander, carried on the work. There was John Bell, John Goodseer, and a man named Robert Knox. Each of them helped turn anatomy from something old-fashioned and rough into a proper modern science. Because of their efforts, Edinburgh came to be mentioned in the same breath as Leiden in the Netherlands and Padua in Italy. These were the three great centers of anatomical study in Europe at the time. Now teaching anatomy meant teaching surgery. And teaching surgery required something very specific. You couldn't just talk about the human body. You couldn't just draw pictures of it. You had to show your students the real thing. You needed cadavers, dead bodies laid out on a table, so students could see for themselves how muscles connected to bone, how organs sat inside the chest, how everything fit together. And as Edinburgh's reputation grew, more and more students came to study there, which meant more and more bodies were needed. But the law in Scotland was strict about where those bodies could come from. There were only a few categories of people whose remains could legally be handed over for dissection. People who had died in prison, people who had died by suicide, and foundlings and orphans, people who had no family to claim them or arrange a burial. That was the entire legal supply. For a while, it may have been enough. But as the number of students kept growing and the number of lectures and classes kept increasing, the supply fell further and further behind the demand. There simply were not enough legally obtained bodies to go around. And so an illegal trade began to fill the gap. It started quietly at first. Some of the students themselves got involved. Some lecturers knew about it and looked the other way. And then there were people who made it their actual livelihood. They were called resurrection men. What they did was straightforward, if unpleasant. They went into graveyards at night, dug up freshly buried bodies, and sold them to the anatomy schools. It was dirty, exhausting, and secretive work, but it paid well enough. The legal situation around it was oddly complicated. Disturbing a grave was a crime. Taking anything that belonged to the dead person, their clothes, a ring, a pocket watch, that was also a crime. But taking the body itself was not technically theft. Under the law, a dead body didn't belong to anyone. It wasn't considered property at all, so the resurrection men learned to be careful about how they operated. They would strip the body of everything, leave the clothes and belongings behind in the coffin, and take only the corpse. That way they could argue, if it ever came to it, that they hadn't actually stolen anything. The price for a body varied depending on the time of year. In the summer, when warm weather made bodies decompose faster, the going rate was about £8. In the winter, when the cold kept things preserved longer and the anatomists could take more time with their work, the price went up to around £10. These were significant sums at the time, enough to make the grim work worthwhile for those willing to do it. But the people of Edinburgh knew what was going on, and they were not happy about it. By the 1820s, there were public protests in the streets. The idea that a recently buried family member might be dug up and cut apart on some lecture table was horrifying to ordinary people. And when the authorities didn't seem to be doing enough about it, citizens started finding their own ways to protect their dead. Some families hired guards to sit by a fresh grave through the night. Watchtowers were built in several cemeteries so that a lookout could keep an eye on things from above. One of these towers was put up in Dalkeith near Edinburgh in 1827. Other families hired heavy stone slabs that could be laid over a grave for a few weeks, just long enough for the body underneath to decay to the point where no anatomist would want it. Once enough time had passed, the slab was taken away and used for the next family who needed it. And then there were the so-called mortsafes. A mortsafe was a cage made of iron that was placed around the coffin, either above or just below ground level. If you go to Greyfriars Kirkyard in Edinburgh, you can still see one today. Heavy iron bars, dark with rust, surrounding the place where a coffin once rested. All of these measures, the guards, the watchtowers, the stone slabs, the iron cages, they all worked to some degree. They made it harder for the resurrection men to do their job. But that created another problem entirely. The harder it became to dig up bodies, the fewer bodies reached the anatomy schools. And the anatomists were already struggling to get enough. The historian Ruth Richardson described it as a growing atmosphere of crisis among the medical profession. The demand was there, the students were there, and the teachers were there. But the bodies were becoming harder and harder to come by. And it was in this atmosphere, this tense and difficult situation, that two men saw an opportunity. Another historian, Tim Marshall, put it simply. He said that Burke and Hare took grave robbing to its logical conclusion. Instead of digging up the dead, they decided it would be easier and more profitable to create the dead themselves. But that part of the story comes later. For now, just picture the city as it was. Edinburgh in the 1820s, a place of learning and ambition, of medical progress and scientific discovery. But also a place where the supply of dead bodies had become a serious and growing problem, one that would soon take a very dark turn. Robert Knox was born in Edinburgh, and from an early age, his life was shaped by both brilliance and misfortune. As a child, he contracted smallpox, and the disease left its mark on him for the rest of his life. He lost the sight in one eye and his face was badly disfigured, but none of that slowed him down. He qualified as a surgeon in 1814, and just a year later, he found himself serving as an army physician at one of the most famous battles in European history, the Battle of Waterloo in 1815. After Waterloo, he was posted to England for a time, and then sent further afield to southern Africa, where he served during the Cape Frontier War in 1819. It wasn't until 1820 that Knox finally returned to the city where he had been born and decided to settle there for good. Edinburgh was where he wanted to be, and Edinburgh was where he would make his name. By 1825, he had become a Fellow of the Royal College of Surgeons of Edinburgh, and it was there that he began to lecture on anatomy. He was not a man who did things halfway. He carried out dissections twice a day, every day, and he made bold promises in his advertising. Every course of lectures he delivered, he said, would include a full demonstration on fresh anatomical subjects, fresh being the key word there. Not preserved specimens that had been sitting in jars for months, not old, dried-out remains pulled from storage. Fresh bodies recently deceased, laid out on the table for his students to examine up close. It was a bold commitment, and it required a steady and reliable supply of cadavers. But Knox delivered on his promise, and students responded to it. He claimed that his lessons drew over 400 pupils at a time. 400 people packed into a lecture hall, watching as Knox, with his one good eye and his scarred face, walked them through the inner workings of the human body. He was, by all accounts, a captivating teacher. His biographer in the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography, Claire Taylor, wrote that Knox built up a formidable reputation as a teacher and lecturer, and almost single-handedly raised the profile of the study of anatomy in Britain. That is not a small claim, but by most accounts, it was a fair one. Another biographer, Isabel Ray, went even further. She wrote that without Knox, the study of anatomy in Britain might not have progressed as it did. So here was a man who had survived childhood disease, who had served in war, who had traveled across continents, and who had come home to Edinburgh to do the thing he was best at: teaching people how the human body worked. He was respected, he was popular, and he was ambitious. But that ambition, and especially that promise of fresh anatomical subjects for every course of lectures, meant that Knox needed bodies. He needed a lot of them, and he needed them regularly. And in a city where the legal supply was already stretched thin, and where the resurrection men were finding it harder and harder to do their work, that need would eventually lead Knox into a very difficult position. One that would shadow his name for the rest of his life and long after it. William Burke was born in 1792 in Erney, County Tyrone, in Ireland. He was one of two sons, and his family was comfortably middle class. He and his brother Constantine had a decent upbringing, and both of them joined the military while they were still teenagers. Burke served in the Donegal militia for a time, and during that period he met a woman from County Mayo. They married and the couple settled in her home county, but the marriage did not last long. In 1818, Burke got into an argument with his father-in-law over land ownership, and that was apparently enough to make him walk away from everything. He deserted his wife and his family and left Ireland altogether. He crossed the sea to Scotland and found work as a laborer on the Union Canal. He settled in the small village of Maddiston near Falkirk, and it was there that he met a woman named Helen MacDougall. He called her Nellie, and the two of them set up a home together. She became his second wife. For a few years, life in Maddiston seems to have been stable enough. But when the work on the canal was finished, Burke and Nellie needed to find something else. In November of 1827, the couple moved to Edinburgh and took up lodgings at a place called Tanner's Close. They started out as hawkers, buying and selling second-hand clothes to the poorer people in the area. After a while, Burke took up cobbling, and he turned out to be reasonably good at it. He was earning upwards of £1 a week, which was a decent living for the time and place. People in the neighborhood seemed to like him well enough. He was known as a hard worker with a good sense of humor, the kind of man who would sing and dance on a customer's doorstep while doing business with them. He had been raised a Roman Catholic back in Ireland, but in Edinburgh he became a regular at Presbyterian meetings held in the Grassmarket. He was rarely seen without a Bible in his hand. By all outward appearances, William Burke was a likable, industrious, and God-fearing man. William Hare is a harder figure to pin down. Even basic facts about him are uncertain. He was probably born somewhere in the north of Ireland, either in County Armagh, County Londonderry, or in the town of Newry. His exact year of birth is unknown, and when he was arrested in 1828, he told the authorities he was 21 years old. But other sources suggest he was born sometime between 1792 and 1804, so that claim may not have been truthful. Very little is known about his early life. He may have worked as an agricultural laborer in Ireland before crossing over to Britain. What is known is that he spent about 7 years working on the Union Canal, the same canal where Burke had also worked, before moving to Edinburgh sometime in the mid-1820s. Once in Edinburgh, he found work as an assistant to a coal man. He took lodgings at Tanner's Close, in a house run by a man named Logg and his wife, Margaret Laird, in the Westport area of the city. When Logg died in 1826, Hare may have married Margaret, though the details around that are not entirely clear. What is clear is that Hare was a very different sort of man from Burke. The historian Brian Bailey, in his account of the murders, described Hare as illiterate and uncouth, a lame, quarrelsome, violent, and amoral character, with scars from old wounds about his head and brow. He was, by most accounts, not someone you would want to cross. Bailey described Margaret in similarly unflattering terms, calling her a hard-featured and debauched virago. She was also an Irish immigrant, and together she and Hare made for a rough pair. It was in 1827 that the paths of these two men came together. Burke and Nellie MacDougall had gone to Penicuik in Midlothian to work on the harvest. And it was there that Burke met Hare for the first time. The two men got along and a friendship developed between them. When Burke and Nellie returned to Edinburgh afterwards, they moved into the lodging house that Hare and Margaret were running at Tanner's Close. The four of them, Burke and Nellie, Hare and Margaret, quickly became known in the neighborhood. Not for anything sinister, not yet, but for hard drinking and loud, boisterous behavior. They were a noisy household, the kind of place where the neighbors probably heard more than they wanted to. But at that point in late 1827, that was all it was. Four Irish immigrants living together in a cramped lodging house in one of the poorer parts of Edinburgh, drinking too much and making too much noise. Nothing about them from the outside would have suggested what was coming next. On the 29th of November, 1827, a lodger in Hare's house died. His name was Donald, and the cause of death was dropsy. The timing was particularly unfortunate for Hare, because Donald had been expecting a quarterly army pension, which he had not yet received. On top of that, he owed Hare £4 in back rent. So Hare was left with a dead lodger, no pension money coming in, and an unpaid debt he could never collect. He complained about this to Burke, and somewhere in that conversation, the two men came up with an idea. They would sell Donald's body to one of the local anatomists. A carpenter had already been called in to provide a coffin, paid for by the local parish, and the burial was being arranged. But after the carpenter left, Burke and Hare opened the coffin, lifted out the body, and hid it under the bed. They filled the coffin with bark from a nearby tannery, sealed it back up, and let the burial go ahead as planned. Nobody noticed the difference. After dark that same day, the two men carried the body to Edinburgh University and went looking for a buyer. According to Burke's later testimony, they asked for directions to Professor Monro, but a student pointed them instead toward the premises of Robert Knox in Surgeons Square. When they arrived, they dealt first with some of Knox's junior staff, but it was Knox himself who came to settle on a price. He offered them £7 and 10 shillings. Hare took £4 and 5 shillings, the larger share, to cover the rent that Donald had owed him. Burke took the remaining £3 and 5 shillings. For both men, it was good money for very little effort. And as they were leaving, according to Burke's official confession, one of Knox's assistants told them that the anatomists would be glad to see them again when they had another body to dispose of. That remark may well have changed the course of everything that followed. A little over 2 months later, in January or February of 1828, the first murder took place. There is no agreement among historians about the exact order of all the killings. Burke himself made 2 separate confessions and gave a different sequence in each one. The first was an official statement given on the 3rd of January, 1829, to the sheriff substitute, the procurator fiscal, and the assistant sheriff clerk. The second was an interview published in the Edinburgh Courant on the 7th of February that same year. Hare's own account differed from both of Burke's, though the two men agreed on many of the details of how the murders were carried out. Later historians, including Brian Bailey, Lisa Rossner, and Owen Dudley Edwards, have each tried to piece together the timeline, sometimes following one of the original accounts and sometimes proposing their own order. What most sources do agree on is that the first victim was either a miller named Joseph, who was lodging at Hare's house, or a salt seller named Abigail Simpson. The historian Lisa Rossner considers Joseph the more likely first victim. Joseph had developed a fever and had become delirious, and that was a problem for Hare and his wife. Having a potentially infectious lodger in the house was bad for business because it would scare away anyone else who might want to stay there. So Hare turned to Burke once again. They gave Joseph whiskey, and once he was sufficiently drunk, Hare placed his hand over the man's nose and mouth while Burke lay across his upper body to hold him still. The method was simple but effective. Burke's weight on the chest stopped the victim from moving or making noise, and it also prevented the lungs from expanding even if any air got past Hare's grip. The historian Lisa Rossner described this technique as ingenious, noting that it would have been practically undetectable until the era of modern forensics. They carried the body to Knox, who paid them £10 this time. The novelist Sir Walter Scott, who took a keen interest in the case, also believed that Joseph was the first victim and pointed out that there was an additional motive beyond money, since the man's illness made him a liability to the household. After Joseph, the next two victims came in quick succession, though again the exact order is debated. One was Abigail Simpson, and the other was an unnamed Englishman from Cheshire. The Englishman was a traveling seller of matches and tinder who had fallen ill with jaundice while staying at Hare's lodging house. As with Joseph, Hare was worried about the effect of having a sick lodger, and the two men used the same method to kill him. Simpson was a pensioner who lived in the nearby village of Gilmerton and would come into Edinburgh to supplement her income by selling salt. On the 12th of February 1828, the only exact date Burke ever mentioned in his confession, she was invited into the Hare's house and given so much alcohol that she was too drunk to make her way home. After they murdered her, Burke and Hare placed her body in a tea chest and delivered it to Knox. They received £10 for the body, and Burke later recalled that Knox approved of it being so fresh, but did not ask any questions. Sometime in either February or March of that year, an old woman was invited into the house by Margaret Hare. Margaret gave her enough whiskey to put her to sleep, and when Hare came home that afternoon, he covered the sleeping woman's mouth and nose with the bed tick, a stiff mattress cover, and simply left her there. By nightfall, she was dead. Burke came by later to help transport the body to Knox, who paid another £10. In early April, Burke met two women in the Canongate area of Edinburgh. Their names were Mary Patterson, who was also known as Mary Mitchell, and Janet Brown. He bought them drinks and invited them back for breakfast. The three of them left the tavern carrying 2 bottles of whiskey and ended up at the house of Burke's brother Constantine. After Constantine left for work, they finished the whiskey, and Patterson fell asleep at the table. Burke and Brown kept talking, but they were interrupted by MacDougall, who accused Burke of having an affair with the women. A fight broke out between Burke and MacDougall, during which he threw a glass at her and cut her above the eye. Brown said she hadn't known Burke was married and left the house. MacDougall also left and went to fetch Hare and his wife. When they arrived, the two men locked their wives out of the room and murdered Patterson while she slept. That afternoon, they delivered the body to Knox in a tea chest. MacDougall kept Patterson's skirt and petticoats for herself. They were paid £8 for the corpse, which was still warm when it arrived. One of Knox's assistants, a man named Ferguson, thought he recognized the woman and asked where they had got her. Burke told him that the girl had drunk herself to death and that they had purchased the body from an old woman in the Canongate. Knox was delighted with the corpse and stored it in whiskey for 3 months before dissecting it. When Janet Brown later came looking for her friend, she was told that Patterson had left for Glasgow with a traveling salesman. At some point in early to mid-1828, a woman named Mrs. Haldane came to lodge at Hare's premises. Burke described her as a stout old woman. After she became drunk, she fell asleep in the stable and was smothered there. Her body was sold to Knox. Several months later, Haldane's daughter, who went by either Margaret or Peggy, also ended up lodging at Hare's house. She and Burke drank together heavily, and he killed her on his own without any help from Hare. Her body was placed in a tea chest and taken to Knox, who paid £8. The next murder happened in May of 1828, when an old woman joined the house as a lodger. One evening while she was drunk, Burke smothered her by himself, as Hare was not in the house at the time. Her body was sold to Knox for £10. After that came a woman known as Effie, sometimes spelled Effie. She was what people at the time called a cinder gatherer, someone who scavenged through bins and rubbish tips looking for anything she could sell. Effie was known to Burke personally because she had sold him scraps of leather for his cobbling work in the past. Burke lured her into the stable with whiskey, and when she was drunk enough, he and Hare killed her. Knox paid £10 for the body. Another victim was a woman Burke found too drunk to stand on the street. A local constable was trying to help her back to her lodgings when Burke stepped in and offered to take her there himself. The policeman was happy to hand her over, and Burke brought her back to Hare's house instead. She was killed there, and her body brought another 10 pounds from Knox. In June, Burke and Hare murdered 2 people on the same day, an old woman and her grandson, a boy who could not speak. Burke later described them in his confession simply as an old woman and a dumb boy. While the boy sat by the fire in the kitchen, his grandmother was taken into the bedroom and killed in the usual way. Then Burke and Hare went back to the kitchen, picked up the boy, carried him to the same room, and killed him too. Burke later said that this was the murder that disturbed him the most. He was haunted by the memory of the boy's expression. The tea chest they normally used to transport the bodies was too small for 2, so they forced both bodies into a herring barrel and took them to Surgeon Square. Knox paid 8 pounds for each body. According to Burke's confession, they loaded the barrel onto a cart, but Hare's horse refused to pull it any further than the grass market. Hare called a porter with a hand cart to help him the rest of the way. Once back in Tanner's Close, Hare took out his frustration on the horse and shot it dead in the yard. On the 24th of June, Burke and MacDougall left Edinburgh to visit her father in Falkirk. Burke knew that Hare was short of money at the time and had even been pawning his clothes to get by. But when the couple returned, they found Hare wearing new clothes and carrying extra cash. Burke asked him about it, and Hare denied that he had sold another body. So Burke went and checked with Knox directly, and Knox confirmed that Hare had indeed sold him a woman's body for 8 pounds. This led to a serious falling out between the 2 men, and they came to blows over it. Burke and MacDougall moved out of Tanner's Close and into the home of Burke's cousin, John Brogan, 2 streets away. But the split between them did not last long. In late September or early October, Hare came to visit Burke at his new lodgings, and a washerwoman named Mrs. Ostler happened to come by the property to do the laundry. The 2 men got her drunk and killed her. Her body was with Knox that same afternoon, and they received 8 pounds for it. A week or 2 after that, one of MacDougall's relatives, a woman named Anne Dougal, came to visit from Falkirk. After she had been staying with them for a few days, the men killed her in the usual way and received 10 pounds for the body. Burke later claimed that around this time, Hare's wife suggested they kill Helen MacDougall on the grounds that they couldn't trust her because she was a Scotch woman. Burke refused. The next victim was someone well known in the streets of Edinburgh. His name was James Wilson, and he was 18 years old. He walked with a limp because of deformed feet, and he was mentally disabled. People in the area knew him as Daft Jamie. He was by all accounts a harmless person who lived on the streets and supported himself by begging. In November, Hare lured Wilson to his lodgings with the promise of whiskey and sent his wife to fetch Burke. The 2 men led Wilson into a bedroom, and Margaret locked the door behind them before pushing the key back under it. But Wilson was not like most of their other victims. He didn't like drinking much whiskey, preferring snuff instead, so he was not nearly as drunk as the others had been. He was also strong, and when the 2 men attacked him, he fought back hard. But he was outnumbered, and in the end they overpowered him and killed him in the usual way. They stripped his body and took the few things he owned. Burke kept a snuff box and Hare took a snuff spoon. When Knox and his students examined the body the following day, several students recognized it as James Wilson. But Knox denied it could be anyone they knew. When word began to spread around Edinburgh that Wilson was missing, Knox moved quickly to dissect the body ahead of the others he had in storage. He removed the head and the feet before carrying out the main dissection, so that the most recognizable parts of Wilson would be gone. The last victim was a middle-aged Irish woman named Margaret Docherty, and she was killed on the 31st of October, 1828. Burke lured her into the Brogan lodging house by claiming that his own mother had also been a Docherty from the same part of Ireland. The 2 of them began drinking together. At one point, Burke left Docherty in the company of MacDougall and went out, supposedly to buy more whiskey, but actually to fetch Hare. There were 2 other lodgers in the house that day, a couple named Anne and James Gray. They were an inconvenience, so Burke and Hare paid them to spend the night at Hare's lodging instead, telling them that Docherty was a relative who was visiting. The drinking continued into the evening, and Margaret Hare joined in as well. At around 9 in the evening, the Greys came back briefly to collect some clothing for their children, and what they saw was Burke, Hare, both wives, and Docherty, all drunk, singing and dancing together. Although Burke and Hare apparently got into a fight with each other at some point that evening, they still managed to murder Docherty afterwards. They placed her body in a pile of straw at the end of the bed. The next day, the Greys came back to the house. Anne Grey became suspicious when Burke would not let her go near the bed where she had left a pair of stockings. Later, when they found themselves alone in the house, the Greys searched through the straw and found Docherty's body. There was blood and saliva on her face. They headed straight out to alert the police, but on the way they ran into MacDougall, who tried to bribe them with an offer of £10 a week to keep quiet. They refused. While the Greys were reporting the murder, Burke and Hare removed the body from the house and took it to Knox's surgery. When the police searched the house, they found Docherty's blood-stained clothing hidden under the bed. Burke and his wife were questioned, and both claimed that Docherty had left the house on her own. But they gave different times for when she had supposedly departed, and that was enough to raise suspicion. The police took them in for further questioning. Early the following morning, officers went to Knox's dissecting rooms, where they found Docherty's body. James Gray identified her as the woman he had seen with Burke and Hare. Hare and his wife were arrested that same day, along with Brogan. All of them denied knowing anything about what had happened. In total, 16 people were killed by Burke and Hare over a period of about 10 months. Burke said later that he and Hare were generally in a state of intoxication when the murders were carried out. He said he could not sleep at night without a bottle of whiskey by his bedside and a tuppenny candle burning until morning. When he woke, he would take a drink from the bottle, sometimes half a bottle in a single draught, and that would be enough to put him back to sleep. He also took opium to ease his conscience. On the 3rd of November 1828, a warrant was issued for the detention of Burke, Hare, and both of their wives. Brogan, Burke's cousin, was released without any further action being taken against him. The 4 suspects were separated from each other, and statements were taken from each of them individually. When the police compared those statements to the answers the 4 had given on the day of their arrests, the stories did not match up. A police surgeon named Alexander Black carried out an initial examination of Margaret Docherty's body. After that, 2 forensic specialists were brought in to take a closer look. Their names were Robert Christison and William Newbegin. After their examination, they reported that it was probable the victim had been murdered by suffocation. However, they could not prove it medically. The damage to the body was consistent with suffocation, but there was no way to say with certainty that it could not have had some other cause. Still, on the basis of what the 2 doctors had found, all 4 suspects were formally charged with murder. As part of his investigation, Christison also interviewed Robert Knox. Knox told him that Burke and Hare had simply been watching the poor lodging houses around Edinburgh and purchasing the bodies of people who had died before anyone came to claim them for burial. Christison did not believe Knox was entirely innocent in all of this. He later described the anatomist as deficient in principle and heart. But at the same time, he did not think Knox had actually broken the law. The police were confident that a murder had taken place, and they were fairly sure that at least one of the 4 suspects was responsible. But they were not at all confident they could secure a conviction in court. The forensic evidence was suggestive, but not conclusive. They also suspected there had been other murders beyond just Margaret Docherty, but without any bodies to examine, that line of investigation had nowhere to go. As news of the case began to spread, and as rumors of additional murders reached the public, the newspapers started publishing stories that were often sensational and not always accurate. Speculative reports led people around Edinburgh to assume that anyone who had gone missing in recent months must have been a victim of Burke and Hare. Meanwhile, 2 important pieces of evidence came to light. Janet Brown, the woman who had been drinking with Mary Patterson on the morning of her death, went to the police and identified clothing that had belonged to her friend. and a local baker informed the police that a pair of trousers belonging to Jamie Wilson were being worn by Burke's nephew. On the 19th of November, a second warrant was issued, this time for the murder of James Wilson, against all 4 suspects. The Lord Advocate at the time was Sir William Hare, and he decided to follow a well-established legal strategy. Rather than try to convict all 4 at once, he would focus on turning one of them into a witness against the others. He chose Hare for that. On the 1st of December, Hare was offered a deal. If he turned King's evidence, meaning he would testify in court and provide the full details of Docherty's murder and any others, he would be granted complete immunity from prosecution. And because Hare could not legally be compelled to testify against his own wife, Margaret was also exempt from prosecution as part of the arrangement. Hare accepted the deal and made a full confession. He gave details of all 16 deaths. With Hare's testimony in hand, Hare decided there was enough evidence to move forward with a prosecution. On the 4th of December, formal charges were laid against William Burke and Helen MacDougall. They were charged with 3 murders, those of Mary Patterson, James Wilson, and Margaret Docherty. As for Knox, he faced no charges at all. Burke's own statement to the police had cleared the surgeon of any involvement in the killings. Burke insisted that Knox had never encouraged him, never taught him, and never pushed him toward murdering anyone, but the public did not see it that way. As more details of the case appeared in newspapers and broadsides, opinion turned heavily against Knox. Many people in Edinburgh believed he was, as the historian Brian Bailey put it, a sinister ringmaster who got Burke and Hare dancing to his tune. Several broadsides were published, with editorials arguing that Knox should have been standing in the dock alongside the murderers. These publications had a real effect on how people thought about the case. A new word even entered the language because of what had happened. The word was burking, and it meant to smother a victim, or more broadly, to commit a murder for the purpose of selling the body for anatomical study. And a rhyme began circulating through the streets of Edinburgh, one that children and adults alike repeated. It went like this: up the close and down the stair, but in ben with Burke and Hare. Burke's the butcher, Hare's the thief, Knox the boy that buys the beef. It was a simple little verse, but it captured exactly how the people of Edinburgh saw the 3 men and the roles they had played. The trial began at 10 in the morning on Christmas Eve, 1828, inside Parliament House in Edinburgh. It was heard before the High Court of Justiciary, the highest criminal court in Scotland. The presiding judge was the Lord Justice Clerk, David Boyle, and he was supported by 3 other judges, the Lords Meadowbank, Pitmley, and Mackenzie. The doors to the courtroom had opened at 9 that morning, and the place was full almost immediately. Outside Parliament House, a large crowd gathered in the streets, and the authorities were taking no chances with public order. 300 constables were on duty to prevent any disturbances, and both infantry and cavalry were kept on standby as a further precaution. The case ran straight through the day, through the night, and into the following morning without a break. The historian Lisa Rossner noted that even a formal pause in proceedings, something as ordinary as stopping for dinner, could have raised legal questions about the validity of the trial, so the court pressed on without interruption. When the charges were read out, both defense lawyers immediately raised an objection to Burke and MacDougall being tried together. James Moncrieff, who was representing Burke, protested that his client was being charged with 3 separate and unconnected murders, each committed at a different time and in a different place, and that he was being tried alongside another defendant who was not even alleged to have had any involvement in 2 of the 3 killings. Several hours were spent arguing the legal merits of this objection. In the end, the judge agreed that the trial should be split into separate charges for each of the 3 murders to ensure fairness. He then gave the Lord Advocate, Sir William Hare, the choice of which charge to proceed with first. Hare chose the murder of Margaret Docherty, since the prosecution had her body and the strongest evidence relating to her death. In the early afternoon, both Burke and MacDougall entered pleas of not guilty to the murder of Docherty. The prosecution had prepared a list of 55 potential witnesses, which included both Hare and Knox. Not all of them were called to give evidence, and notably, Knox and 3 of his assistants avoided being questioned in court altogether. However, one of Knox's assistants, a man named David Patterson, was called to the stand. He had been the main person Burke and Hare dealt with when delivering bodies to Knox's surgery, and he confirmed that the pair had supplied the doctor with several corpses. In the early evening, Hare himself took the stand to give his evidence. Under cross-examination about the murder of Docherty, he claimed that Burke had been the sole killer. He also said that MacDougall had been involved on 2 occasions during the evening by bringing Docherty back into the house after the woman had run outside. As for his own role, Hare said he had only assisted Burke in delivering the body to Knox after Docherty was already dead. The lawyers tried to ask Hare about the other murders, but he was not obliged to answer those questions, since the charge before the court related only to the death of Docherty. After Hare finished his testimony, his wife Margaret was called to the witness box. She entered the courtroom carrying their baby daughter, who had developed whooping cough. Margaret used the child's coughing fits to her advantage, pausing after difficult questions and taking her time before answering while she tended to the baby. She told the court that she had a very poor memory and that she could not recall many of the events she was being asked about. The final witnesses for the prosecution were the 2 doctors, Alexander Black and Robert Christison. Both of them said they suspected foul play in the death of Margaret Docherty. But both also admitted that there was no forensic evidence strong enough to prove that she had been murdered. No witnesses were called for the defense. Instead, the pre-trial statements that Burke and MacDougall had each given were read out to the court in their place. After the prosecution delivered its closing arguments, Burke's defense lawyer, James Moncrieff, began his final statement at 3 in the morning. He spoke for 2 hours. At 5 in the morning, MacDougall's defense lawyer began his address to the jury on behalf of his client. After both defense statements were finished, the judge gave his own summing up. Boyle directed the jury to accept the arguments put forward by the prosecution. The jury retired to consider its verdict at 8:30 on the morning of Christmas Day, 1828. They returned 50 minutes later. For William Burke, the verdict was guilty of the murder of Margaret Docherty. For Helen MacDougall, the verdict was not proven. Not proven was a distinctly Scottish legal verdict, one that acquitted the defendant on the grounds that the prosecution had failed to prove their guilt, without going so far as to declare them innocent. MacDougall was free to go, Burke was not. As he passed the sentence of death, Judge Boyle addressed Burke directly. He told him that his body should be publicly dissected and anatomized. And he added that he trusted, if it was ever customary to preserve skeletons, that Burke's would be preserved, in order that posterity may keep in remembrance his atrocious crimes. Helen MacDougall was released at the end of the trial and made her way home. The following day she went out to buy whiskey, and almost immediately she was confronted by an angry mob. The people of Edinburgh were furious about the not-proven verdict, and they made their feelings known. MacDougall was taken to a police building in nearby Fountain Bridge for her own safety, but the crowd followed her there and laid siege to the building. She escaped through a back window and made her way to the main police station off Edinburgh's High Street. She tried to see Burke one last time, but permission was refused. The next day she left Edinburgh altogether, and after that there are no clear accounts of what became of her. On the 3rd of January, 1829, Burke made another confession. He did so on the advice of both Catholic priests and Presbyterian clergy who had been visiting him. This second confession was more detailed than the official one he had given before the trial, and in it he placed much of the blame for the murders on Hare. Meanwhile, the question of Hare's immunity was causing outrage beyond the public at large. On the 16th of January, a petition was submitted on behalf of James Wilson's mother and sister, protesting against Hare's deal and his intended release from prison. The High Court of Justiciary gave the petition lengthy consideration, but in the end it was rejected by a vote of 4-2. Margaret Hare was released on the 19th of January and traveled to Glasgow, where she planned to find a ship back to Ireland. But while she was waiting for a vessel, she was recognized by people in the city. A mob attacked her and she had to be given shelter in a police station. Eventually, she was given a police escort directly onto a ship bound for Belfast. Once she landed in Ireland, she disappeared from the record, and no clear accounts exist of what happened to her after that. William Burke was hanged on the morning of the 28th of January, 1829. The crowd that gathered to watch his execution may have been as large as 25,000 people. Windows in the tenement buildings that overlooked the scaffold were rented out to spectators at prices ranging from 5 shillings to 20 shillings, depending on the view. It was, by any measure, a public spectacle on an enormous scale, but the story did not end with the hanging. On the 1st of February, Burke's body was taken to the Anatomy Theatre at the university's old college, where it was publicly dissected by Professor Monro. A limited number of tickets had been issued for the event, and when large numbers of students gathered outside demanding access, the police had to be called. A minor riot broke out, and order was only restored after one of the university professors negotiated a compromise with the crowd. The students would be allowed to pass through the theater in batches of 50 after the dissection was complete. The dissection itself lasted about 2 hours. During the procedure, Monro dipped his quill pen into Burke's blood and wrote a short note. It read, "This is written with the blood of William Burke, who was hanged at Edinburgh, and this blood was taken from his head." After the dissection, Burke's skeleton was given to the Anatomical Museum of the Edinburgh Medical School, where it remains on display to this day. His death mask, along with a book said to be bound with his tanned skin, can be seen at Surgeons' Hall Museum. Hare was released on the 5th of February, 1829. His stay in prison had been extended well beyond what was legally necessary, purely for his own protection, because the authorities knew what would happen if he was let out too soon. When the time came, he was helped to leave Edinburgh in disguise, traveling by mail coach to Dumfries. But at one of the stops along the way, he was recognized by a fellow passenger. The man who spotted him was Erskine Douglas Sanford, a junior lawyer who had represented the family of James Wilson during the legal proceedings. Sanford told the other passengers who Hare was, and by the time the coach arrived in Dumfries, word had already spread through the town. A large crowd gathered at the inn where Hare was supposed to spend the night. The police arrived and came up with a plan. They sent a decoy coach out to draw the crowd away from the building, while Hare slipped out through a back window and into a waiting carriage that took him to the town's prison for safekeeping. But the crowd soon figured out what had happened, and they surrounded the prison. Stones were thrown at the doors and windows, and street lamps were smashed before a force of 100 special constables arrived to restore order. In the early hours of the morning, Hare was escorted out of town by a sheriff officer and a militia guard. They set him down on the road to Annan and told him to make his way south to the English border. After that, there were no reliable sightings of William Hare ever again. His eventual fate is unknown. As for Robert Knox, he refused to make any public statements about his dealings with Burke and Hare. But the people of Edinburgh had already made up their minds about him. He was mocked in caricatures that circulated around the city, and in February of 1829, a crowd gathered outside his house and burned an effigy of him. A formal committee of inquiry was eventually set up to examine his role in the affair. The committee cleared him of any direct involvement, reporting that they had seen no evidence that Knox or his assistants knew that murder was committed in procuring any of the subjects brought to his rooms. But that official clearance did little to repair his reputation. Knox resigned from his position as curator of the College of Surgeons Museum, and over the following years he was gradually pushed out of university life by his own colleagues. In 1842, he left Edinburgh for good. He spent the next several years lecturing in various places around Britain and mainland Europe, but his career never recovered. While working in London, he fell foul of the regulations of the Royal College of Surgeons and was barred from lecturing. In 1848, he was removed from the roll of Fellows of the Royal Society of Edinburgh. From 1856 onwards, he worked as a pathological anatomist at the Brompton Cancer Hospital and maintained a small medical practice in Hackney. He died there in 1862, a long way from the fame and prestige he had once enjoyed in Edinburgh. Even before the crimes of Burke and Hare came to light, the question of how to supply enough cadavers for scientific research had already been a topic of serious discussion. The English philosopher Jeremy Bentham had been among those promoting the idea that the law needed to change. And in mid-1828, about 6 months before the murders were actually discovered, a parliamentary select committee had already drafted a bill. It was called a Bill for Preventing the Unlawful Disinterment of Human Bodies and for Regulating Schools of Anatomy. The bill made its way through Parliament, but in 1829 it was rejected by the House of Lords. So the law stayed as it was, at least for the time being. But the murders committed by Burke and Hare had done something that years of quiet lobbying had not. They had brought the issue directly into the public eye. People across Britain were now aware, in vivid and uncomfortable detail, of the trade that doctors had been conducting with grave robbers and, in this case, with murderers. The story was impossible to ignore, and it changed the way ordinary people thought about what was happening behind the doors of the anatomy schools. And it was not just Edinburgh where things had gone wrong. In London, a 14-year-old boy was murdered in the East End, and those responsible attempted to sell his body to the medical school at King's College London. The case led to an investigation of a group who became known as the London Burkers, men who had recently made the same transition that Burke and Hare had made, moving from digging up the dead to killing the living in order to obtain corpses for sale. 2 of these men were hanged in December of 1831 for their crimes. Coming so soon after the Burke and Hare case, the London murders made it clear that this was not an isolated problem confined to one city. It was a systemic failure, and it demanded a legislative response. This time, Parliament acted quickly. A new bill was introduced, and it moved through both houses with far less resistance than the earlier attempt had met. 9 months after being introduced, it received royal assent and became the Anatomy Act of 1832. The act changed things significantly. It authorized the dissection of bodies from workhouses that went unclaimed after 48 hours, which meant there was now a legal and regulated supply of cadavers for the anatomy schools. It also ended the old practice of anatomizing the bodies of executed murderers as part of their death sentence. In other words, dissection was no longer a punishment. It was now simply a practical matter governed by law. The Burke and Hare case had not been the only reason for the change, but it had been the event that made the change unavoidable. The public outcry, the newspaper coverage, the fear and the anger, all of it had created the political pressure that finally pushed the legislation through. And in Scotland, the memory of what had happened lingered for a very long time. Among the traveling community in particular, stories of Burkers and Noddies were passed down through the generations. These were not just historical curiosities, but living fears, warnings to be careful around strangers, warnings to stay away from certain places. A broader distrust of hospitals and doctors took root in some communities, and it held on well into the 20th century. The names Burke and Hare had become something more than just the names of 2 men. They had become a kind of shorthand for a particular type of horror, the idea that the institutions meant to heal you might not always have your best interests at heart.